Well, good evening, everybody. Art Nouveau to Brutalist, yes, with London's underground stations. It's a long story of corporate pride, brand identification, and innovation, to be quite honest. I'm going to start with some definitions. When I can get the screen to move. Well, I have a problem getting the screen to move at the moment. Here we go. There we go. Right, some definitions. Starting off with Art Nouveau, as Mary said, it was around the turn of the 20th century, running up until sort of 1910, almost up to the beginning of the First World War. Basically, a lot of it was around organic shapes and intricate details, some of it rising from the arts and crafts movement of the slightly earlier period. Art Deco was between the wars. The term comes from the Paris exhibition in 1925, but the term Art Deco wasn't really coined or wasn't really used that much until 1960s. Prior to that, it was known as either modern or streamline. It involves bold geometric shapes, symmetry, with very little external decoration, and it was made most use of flat roofs in concrete with rounding corners. And then towards later in the period, there's brutalism, functional, exposed structure, concrete, all the things we saw when we had a talk about it last winter. And there is a considerable overlap between these last two groups, between Art Deco and brutalism, as we will see. Right, I'm going to very briefly outline the development of the tube system because it does get quite complicated. Then I'll introduce you to the various architects who were involved in the various processes. Then illustrate each of the major architectural styles with some of the 272 tube stations on the network. But I do promise I'm not showing all 272. It is fortunate in a way that there was a gap between the various periods of expansion of the tube network, because it does mean that they fit neatly into some of the periods of architecture which we're going to be looking at, rather than having a gradual change. So there are step changes in the way some of the stations look. A little bit of context. This is the current tube map, although it doesn't include the Elizabeth line. The red arrows are where I lived in my 50 years in London. I was brought up in the outer north suburb between Cockfosters and Oakwood, and then I moved into central London, and then finally in West Hampstead for 20 odd years. And the purple arrows where I worked. So the tube system was part of absolutely everyday life. I mean, it's you couldn't avoid using the tube if you want to get round it in London with any speed at all. These are the lines that were added in the 1920s and 30s as London expanded quite rapidly between the wars. And then finally, the extension to Heathrow is obviously later, and I haven't included on this map either the Jubilee line extension or the Elizabeth line. So starting with a condensed history of the underground, which does get rather complicated, but it is worth doing because it helps us understand some of the changes we're going to see. Initially, London was only served by trains on the overground lines from the central London rail stations. There wasn't any communication between the central London stations. And then in the 1860s, lines were being set out between the central London stations and in other parts of central London by using the cut and cover method. Deep trenches were dug. This is an illustration from Euston Road in 1865. Deep trenches were dug, tracks and stations were built effectively underground and then covered over afterwards, and which is why so many of them run up and down the major roads, because they were the easiest places to dig up at the time. So Baker Street, Euston Road, Pentonville Road, all those various thoroughfares. The deep board lines, the true tube lines, began in 1908 under the umbrella of the Underground Electric Railway Company. Each line was set up by a different company initially, and they got permission for specific lines that were built over short distances, like Charing Cross to Brompton and Charing Cross to Hampstead, Piccadilly to Brompton. And this went in parallel with the beginning of electrification of some of the surface routes and some of the routes that were run in the cut and cover tunnels. The 1920s, as you saw on the previous map, the 1920s and 30s saw the lines being expanded out into outer London. This was both the move to help transport into London, but also to encourage movement out of London and the development of the suburbs. It continued into the 1930s, and in fact it accelerated as part of the what's now commonly called Metroland, particularly to the north of London. And the lines continued, the surface lines continued to be improved with further electrification. It was brought together in 1933 under the London Transport Board. They obviously saw the sense then to centralise everything. I'm not quite sure why we don't always do it now, but there we are. It's done. But the idea was to bring it together under one set of controls, which seemed to work quite well. And then along with the railways, everything was nationalised after the Second World War in 1948. There were several architects involved, and we'll see their styles are quite different, which reflects in the stations they developed. But we're starting off with Harry Wharton Ford and Charles Walter Clark. These worked for the Metropolitan and District Railways, as they were then, before becoming the various tube lines, which is why I've used the colour that reflects the current line on the map. They were the principal architects for those two companies. Leslie Green, whose stations I'm sure most people know, he was principal architect for the Underground Electric Railway Company, but he died when he was 33. It would be interesting to know what would have happened had he lived longer. And then along came Frank Pick. He wasn't an architect, he was a designer, but he did have an enormous influence on the transport in London generally. He's the one who introduced the development of the roundel for the underground stations. He also introduced Edward Johnson's typeface, which has been used ever since, and also Harry Beck's tube map. And also, probably more important than any of these, he commissioned Charles Holden, as we will see in a moment. Stanley Heaps was Leslie Green's assistant, and he took over as the chief architect when Leslie Green died in 1908. And then Charles Holden, whose work we're going to see more of than anybody else's in the next hour or so, or 3/4 of an hour. He was a well-known arts and crafts architect. He was commissioned by Frank Pick, as I said, in 1923. He was brought in over the head of Stanley Heaps, who was then the company's chief architect. And he designed London excuse me. He designed the London Transport Headquarters, or the headquarters for the Passenger Transport Board, as it was then. Well known as 55 Broadway, for anybody who's seen the address written on the side of every single bus that moves around London. Charles James Uren and John Murray Easton all worked at various times with Holden, designing stations around the network, and they developed his designs in a way. And then Brian Lewis and Frank Curtis were architects for Great Western Railway and for British Railways. And because a lot of the lines run over the same tracks, they were involved in some of the station work too. And then finally, Oliver Hill, best known for his design of the Midlands Hotel in Morecambe and his work in Frinton Park. The Midland Hotel in Mortham has recently been refurbished, and it's one of those prestige locations overlooking Morecambe Bay. Um, Streamline absolutely at its best, streamline as a form of architecture. But he also worked in the following years on the estate at Frinton Park. This is a collection of amazing buildings, which are actually, most of which are very well still kept very well up. Unfortunately, the public didn't take to the idea of houses with flat roofs, so the estate never really got fully developed. As you can see, if you look at the bottom left-hand picture here, you can see the roofs of regular 1930s semis behind the beautiful roundhouse. Finally, to some underground stations. Art Nouveau was still the flavour when in the first decade of the 20th century, when the deep bore lines were started. Many new stations are opened on the earlier cut and cover lines too, and they were influenced by the arts and crafts movement, taking cues from the organic shapes and fluid lines from the past. Harry Ford designed the stations on the District Railway. Then we have Barons Court, Fulham Broadway, and Earl's Court. All three they have very different designs and different cues as to the way they look, but they all retain several of the classical elements which were carried over. They're symmetrical. They have columns. They have corbel tables. They have pediments, some of them with broken pediments, like Barons Court. They have plinths, and they're prominent keystones. So there's several classical elements carried over into this style. But they are all in the same colour of glazed tile, which was the District Railway's corporate colour, using tin glazing called faience, which we'll see in other stations too later. At the same time, on the Northern Line, Leslie Green was building with the wider known maroon faience tiles on the line from Charing Cross to Hampstead, including the famous Morning and Crescent. Yes, this was the maroon was the Underground Electric Railway Company's corporate colour, and almost all of his stations were this colour. Some of the classical features were continued, including the prominent keystones and the corbel table and the symmetry. And so at some of the sites, there are slight differences, like at Chalk Farm here, you've got round small windows with drip moulds rather than the square windows at Mornington Crescent, but otherwise basically the features are very similar. Some of the stations had to be developed on awkward sites, like this is the other view of Chalk Farm on the narrow angle between Haverstock Hill and Adelaide Road. And he had to work very carefully with sites like this because he was working in areas which were already developed. So the plots already existed and he had no say over how they were laid out. The adjacent station of Camden Town looks like a mistake, I think, with the rather plain brick buildings on top. But the stations all of his stations were built with steel frames because the terracotta tiling wasn't load bearing, so it required a load bearing frame to be built inside the station, which was capable of supporting upper stories. And you can see why at Goodge Street, especially when you move into central London, land becomes so expensive that if you don't build upwards, then the station becomes difficult to support. And in fact, these days, they tend to build stations with huge office blocks over the top. On the Piccadilly line, similar design to the outside of the station, but here the station has kept a lot of the typical green from the arts and crafts movement and typical green from Art Nouveau with the organic shapes and the wonderful typeface for the in and out next to the ticket window here. This is a typical 1930s looking typeface. A lot of the stations that have been upgraded and improved, some of this stuff has disappeared, but Holloway Road, it was still there when I photographed it. although my photographs weren't as good as the ones from the internet, I have to say. I tried converting them from slides and they didn't work very well. 10 years after this, Stanley Heaps, who took over, as I said, from Frank Green, developed Kilburn Park Station, which was a temporary terminus for the line as it moved northwards. It's very Green-esque in the sense that it has archways and most of the similar architectural foibles that Green had in his. It does retain some of the features, but not all of them. It's got the arches and the corbel table, but it's lost the prominent keystones. But again, it does retain the corporate colour of maroon tiles. One station further up the line, and 10 years later, the Metropolitan Railway, which shares the route but not the actual tracks, the two run in parallel with each other, developed Willesden Green Station, which is a far more classical appearance to it, and in the Metropolitan Railway's colour at the time, which was white rather than the red of the ones we've just been looking at. This is fully classical in the sense not only does it have the corbel table and all the rest of it and pillars, but it has rusticated corners here and deeply scored ashlar lines. So I mean, this is just like the large Georgian arrangements of houses in this area and also further into central London, trying to take on a classical viewpoint. He also designed Chiltern Court. This was designed before the First World War initially, and it was going to be the signature hotel for Chiltern Railways in the same way as all the other mainline railway companies had hotels over their main stations. But after the First World War, this was redesigned to be flats over Baker Street Station. It's actually listed grade 2 star. 5 years later, he was still working with the same sort of materials and many of the same ideas when he redesigned Great Portland Street Station in 1930. But at least here, modernism is slightly trying to creep in with the half-round ends and the loss of things like the corbel table there's a much simpler treatment of the eaves along here. So things were beginning to change a little bit in 1930 as far as Clark was concerned. Charles Holden, as I said, was brought in by Frank Pick. His first major project was the southern extension of the Northern Line down towards Morden. And he was the first to introduce sort of full Art Deco geometric shapes into his designs. Here, the hexagon, which is repeated in other stations on the same line, but built as part of a large block of flats, which repeats the hexagonal shape and in fact completes the hexagonal shape of the booking hall, full of horizontal emphasis, full of steel crittle windows, all typical of the 1930s, but here in 1926, which, as an aside, was just at the same time when Crittle was building his model village in Essex, Silver End, for his workers, so that the windows were becoming much more widely used at this point. Other stations on the line continued some of the same keys to their look. This can't be hexagonal because it's not on a corner site, but it still has the same columns, the same colour, and the same roundels advertising London Underground. Clapham North on the same line, unfortunately, was retiled and rebuilt in 1996. This is what it looked like when it was first built in This is what it looked like in the 1950s. Much more sort of deco, but much more restrained than the Clapham South. Difficult to see why, because they were equally densely populated areas, so the land must have been worth the same, and there must have been the same demand for building flats above. However, it doesn't look anything like as good as it used to. Morden is the southern terminus. Many of the same features again, but again, it's not hexagonal, it's square, but it has the same horizontal emphasis and has the same pillars. And now it has this large 60s brutal office block built above it, which, whether you like it or not, it's not as bad as some of the other monstrosities that have been built on top of tube stations we'll see later. So this was the terminus, as I said, and like many of the rural lines, it was built not only to ease the transport in of the people who were living there already, but to encourage the development of the suburbs, which it quite successfully did. Morden was originally an isolated station. This is what it looked like when it was first built. Again, it was designed to encourage development and you can see all the shop fronts which were waiting to be occupied. The design concept is sort of fully Art Deco at this point, with this very horizontal emphasis, simple, plain, flat facade with flat roofs. So in addition to the new lines that were being built out of London, they were renovating or remodeling some of the lines that were running out to the north of London. So the Piccadilly line stations were being modified and rebuilt, some of them in the 1930s. This is going out west towards Heathrow, repeating the same hexagonal pattern that he developed for the Clapham stations. These were developed by both Holden and Heaps together, using again the white stone with the blue horizontal lines. Obviously, thought to be a successful design because it was used in others, like here at Ealing Common. But behind the station booking halls, the platforms were far more brutalist at this point still. No nice rounded ends, but all cast concrete, bare, but here at least it's painted. And you can see that the back of the booking office here finishes off the hexagonal shape of the front. Right, on a different arm of the Piccadilly, I've lost my place on the. Ah, yes. On a different arm of the Piccadilly, it was extended from South Harrow to Uxbridge, replacing the District Line service on the same tracks. Again, the stations were redesigned. But before I show you it, just to let you know that Frank Pick and Charles Holden went on a tour of modernist buildings in Europe in July 1930. And this was Holden's first European design, and that's European in inverted commas. And so this is Sudbury Town Station, as I say, the first of his European designs. Full modernist, flat concrete roof, deep overhang, large vertical window openings, horizontal steel frame windows, and a complete and utter lack of decoration. This was the first of this style, and it's also the first to be listed Grade 2 star. Most of the tube stations are Grade 2, but this and 3 or 4 others are all listed Grade 2 star. In the same year, the Piccadilly line was extending northward from Finsbury Park out into Hertfordshire, and there are several designs on. These are existing suburbs that these ones are being. So Turnpike Lane, Wood Green, and Bounds Green, all on corner sites, but varied in their treatment. They don't all look the same. They have different treatments within the same sort of design concept. Bare brickwork, crystal windows, and the characteristic ventilation towers for these stations where the lines are still underground. Next, northwards, is the iconic Arnold's Grove, the first of his circular designs. The line here is briefly above ground, so there's no ventilation tower. This again is truly modernist with a large overhang, vertical windows, Um, and it was a regular stop for me as a boy because I had a friend who lived close by. So I remember thinking the station as being rather odd at the time as a 10-year-old, but another two-star listing, unsurprisingly. And inside, you can see the circular theme is continued with the booking kiosk. The next station up the line is probably the most unusual. If you don't know it, this is Southgate Station. It must have shocked the locals at the time because, again, this was built within an existing sort of village-type settlement, if you like, on the edge of London, and had been there since late Victorian or Edwardian times. And this was plonked down right next to it. Again, another two-star listing, unsurprisingly. But it was built as part of an overall concept. It was the roads were changed completely. This was a bus station, and still is. Buses still terminate there, and it also was built as a shopping centre. So rather like Morden, it was designed to encourage more people to move here, use the tube line, and make it more of a hub, if you like. Quite joined up thinking for the 1930s. The next station was Oakwood, which was my local station. And this was originally intended to be the terminus for this arm of the Piccadilly line. But they needed a bigger depot, so they extended the line one station further the following year. But this was originally named Enfield West because there was absolutely nothing here when the station was built. And Enfield was the nearest place of any import, and that was 3 miles away. Didn't stay Enfield West for more than a year or two, and the name Oakwood was coined. Another two-star listing. Again, full modernist and brutal, and inside it is full of exposed concrete beams and everything else. But it is slightly softened by the beginning of the use of the round-ended streamlined kiosks. Rather softens the hard edges of the rest of the station. Outside is this seat, pole and roundel, which is listed separately, grade 2-star. And many's the time I've sat on that seat in the rain waiting for the 107 bus home, and I didn't realise how important that object was at the time. So to get a larger depot between the two stations, Foster's station was added the following year. Again, it was isolated. It's very understated as a station for a terminus, and the local story always was that this was a stopping point and they were going to extend out towards Potter's Bar, but that never happened, and it probably still is an urban myth, I think, rather than anything else. Inside the station, you get a rather interesting concrete copy of an aisled hall with the taller nave and the aisles either side. And it's a good use of the ability of concrete to span a space like this. And you'll see this in other stations where you saw it in Ealing, and they used this quite a lot, especially at the terminal stations when they needed additional platforms. So here you've got 3 lines and 4 platforms. On the east side of London, at the same sort of time, they were redeveloping the stations on what was the district line, because it had just changed hands, but far more understated in the way that they were built. They have similar design concepts, if you like. It's horizontal, lots of glazing, a flat roof, big overhang, and all the rest of it. But as I say, they're far more understated than the stations that Holden was designing on the other end of the same line at the same time. So 1 year later, on the same line at the west end of London, Holden designed this. And it's difficult to see how the company would let both of those go at the same time, but the simple ones on the east of the side of the city, and something like Chiswick Park Station on the west. This, interestingly, is not graded 2-star, it's only grade 2. But I think it's a real credit to his designs that almost 100 years later it still looks modern and still looks, to me, looks quite stunning. After this, they adopted what they called a 5-year new works program. And the idea was to replace most of these stations on the west side of the city and to work on other stations to the north as well. Excuse me. So on the west side, stations were built in newish areas. Some of them were developed, and not all of them, by architects who sort of copied Holden's style, but adapted it sufficiently to make it look different. Park Royal, particularly, is rather nicely put together, I think. So as they were designed by Uren and Welsh and Lander, who were pupils and at one time employees of the same company as Holden. You're beginning to get the trackside furniture looking streamlined in the sense that it has the absidely ended waiting rooms, although the concrete roofs are still very plain and unadorned, which they become better later on. The end of this line is Uxbridge, which, like the other terminuses, termini, pardon me, was designed to encourage development. Uxbridge again was another village-style settlement which existed, but was expanding quickly. So the idea here was that it had a bus station, it had shopping, it had a big roundabout, which was important in the 1930s as cars were beginning to become more popular. But it was designed as an entity like Southgate and like Morden, which was impressive for the time, I think. The platform canopy there is the same as we saw at both Ealing and Cockfosters, so it's a design that works. So obviously it was used in quite a few places. Inevitably, the 5-year programme was interrupted by the Second World War, so a lot of it wasn't completed until after the Second World War, including like the rebuilding of East Finchley Station on the Northern Line. Lovely staircase. And Dollis Hill, which probably has the least attractive entrance of any tube station in London, sandwiched between Edwardian houses on one side and Grunwick's photo processing plant on the other side, for those of you old enough to remember the troubles that happened there in the 70s. But the station itself is far more attractive, if you like. And let me tell you, the waiting rooms on this platform are necessary because it's exposed and extremely windy. So when you're waiting for a train, those curved-ended waiting rooms are very useful. This is probably the example that I was alluding to earlier on when I was talking about things that were built on top of stations. St John's Wood, again built in a Victorian Edwardian suburb, but in the 1960s it had a huge block of flats extended over it called Athena Court. I don't think anything can be said good can be said about this, but it's basically ruined it. They didn't even copy the circular shape above the station, which is to me a great shame. It's completely ruined the station itself. Excuse me, but it does indicate how important the use of expensive inner city land is. If you don't build upwards, then the station itself becomes too expensive. Towards the east side of London, again on the pattern that was built over and extending past the war, Loughton Station was built by John Murray Easton, still fairly modernist in its design, cubic, lots of glass, less of a horizontal emphasis other than for the canopy over the entrance, but it's using gaunt clay bricks rather than red, which is unusual. And inside it's fully plastered out. So again, the brutalist side of the interior of the other stations, which we've seen already, is now being softened. Unfortunately, this is about when the development of this line sort of stopped, so we don't actually get to see how this develops properly. The other stations on the that's the platform of Loughton Station, which is truly streamlined in the sense that not only have you got lots of vertical and horizontal emphases, you actually get nice curved transitions between them, sort of rather like giant mushrooms. These two stations were planned before the Second World War, but not completed until afterwards, mainly because the war stopped the state, obviously stopped the station building, but also the tunnels here were used by Plessy to manufacture armaments for the Second World War, and they didn't clear out until after the Second World War was over. They could restart building work and reopen the stations. Some earlier designs appear to have been copied, but not copied, if you see what I mean. Similar in concept, but rather more vertical than the horizontal that Southgate Station was. This again is trapped in the middle of a gyratory, the huge roundabout where the North Circular meets Western Avenue, which was always a traffic disaster. And difficult to see how people get across there. I never used the station, I must admit. They designed, Lewis and Curtis designed several stations on this line, obviously this one included, but also Greenford, which was rather overshadowed by the railway viaduct of the main line, which runs right past from going out from Paddington. But also Perivale, rather nice, sort of modernist, but has changed the emphasis again to vertical rather than horizontal, including laying the bricks on end above the window, which is rather a nice touch. Still modernism, but with a different flavour to it. And it's very close, Perivale Station, to I think one of the best modern buildings that was ever built. Unfortunately, Pesner described it as that monstrosity, which I think is a bit unfair, really, because it's probably the best example of its type. There was an application to demolish it not long ago, but it was converted, that was refused. It's been converted into flats and is now, the other side of it's occupied by Tesco's, which is why you can see the blue and the red corporate colour at the bottom in the plinth here. But the rest of the colour scheme is still 1930s, which is rather nice. Oh, sorry, he described it as the worst monstrosity, not just the monstrosity. So most of the stations on the tube system were designed in the 1930s, even if they weren't completed until the 1940s or 50s even. So the next stations that were built were on the extension going down to Heathrow, designed by the London Transport Architects Department. Full brutalist here, exposed concrete, everything absolutely bare, totally functional. There were very few stations built in this little ring that goes round onto the airport itself, and the airport station is totally nondescript, so I didn't put a picture of that in. But there are other excellent brutalist examples on the London transport system. First one being,
shall I go and sit next door? Was that what you guys said?
Newbury Park bus station, designed by Oliver Hill only 4 years after he designed the Midland Hotel, which we saw at the beginning. Although it wasn't actually built for another 10 years, it wasn't built until completed until 1948. But what a change of emphasis in his design work from streamlined to this. And the other really good example of brutalism is the Stockwell Bus Garage. I know it's not on the tube system, but it was the largest unsupported concrete span of its time, so I thought I had to put it in. Moving on to the more modern lines, this is the Jubilee Line extension. The collective term apparently for his work, or the work of the partners, is Fosteritos, because of the work they did in Spain. Some stunning designs, and obviously designed to look 21st century and all the rest of it, to go with the buildings that are on Canary Wharf. This particular station repeats some of the design ideas from the 1930s in the seats down in the platform. They quite streamlined in their design in the sense they've got curved ends and soft corners and everything else. So they're reusing the earlier design motifs. Then moving on to the Elizabeth line, or Crossrail as it's often known, they've used a host of different architects to design various aspects of the system. Most of it, of course, is underground, so we don't get to see many station buildings. There are some buildings above ground, like at Customs House, but most of the work is done underground. Be interesting to see whether in 100 years' time these are still considered good examples of the design for what is basically a public transport system, which had been so well served by the designs from the previous 50, 75 years. So the fact that the development of the system was episodic, with a burst around 1905 and another in the 1930s and another one after the war, has enabled quite startling differences to be seen within the architectural designs of each individual station. If the system had developed more gradually, I think there would have been a more gradual change between the various types of architecture, and you wouldn't have seen this amazing difference between the various sorts. We've seen incremental changes rather than the steps in style that are shown here. I hope there are many more of these to come as well. So thank you for listening.
Right. Something's happening here. I don't seem to be showing, but anyway, can you hear me? Oh, yes, there I am. Thank you so much, Ian. Brings back memories to all those people who used to live in London, I'm sure. For instance, before anybody else has a chance, I want to mention where we first lived when we were first married, which was in Barking in Essex, and they had a newly built, is it a tube station or
Happily.
No, Barking. In Barking itself.
Yes, it was rebuilt.
A rebuilt station, which was very much brutalist style and was praised by Ian Nairn, I think, in one of his first books about London. I don't know if you've come across that at any point, but anyway, don't let me hog the screen. I'm sure there are lots of people who would like to raise questions. So shall I pass it over to you, Jess?
Yes, we've got 2 questions in the chat, and if anybody else has any others, please sort of pop them in the chat or sort of raise your hand as well via the emoji button. Owen Warnock says, Googe Street, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Were the upper stories passed with the original design or were they added later?
It's a good question. I tried to find that out and couldn't, basically. The stations were designed to support upper structures, so I assume that they weren't. Nobody's going to come along afterwards and say, "Can we build on top of your station?" I think it must have been planned that way from the start. The cost of land in central London must have prohibited the use of single-story buildings, I would have thought.
And then Linda comments, Southgate anticipates mid-century modern in its style.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it must have been such a shock to the poor Victorian style residents of Southgate who are used to Victorian architecture to have that suddenly plonked on their doorstep. And I'm sure it probably gained the same sort of comments that Pesner gave to the Hoover building, grotesque and it's just too unusual and all the rest of it. I can't find any pictures of Barking Station.
Okay. Well, you don't have to at the moment, but you might be interested. Referring to Southgate, I have a horrible feeling that there are plans afoot to demolish and redevelop that little beautifully planned area. I'm only saying that, I may be wrong, but from my dealings with Civic Voice, I think the sort of civic society in the Southgate area were trying desperately to stop it from being redeveloped. But I'll look into that. It would be a terrible tragedy if that went, I think.
But to demolish that, you'd have to demolish everything that went with it, including
Well,
the
yes,
roundabout and the shops and everything.
well, exactly. I think that's what they want to do. I may be quite wrong, Ian, but I have a feeling that there is certainly a threat hanging over it.
Right.
Does anybody else have any more questions for Ian? There's no more in the chat. I have one relating to the glazed tiles from the Art Nouveau buildings. Do you know where they were produced?
The which building?
The glazed tiles from the Art Nouveau
Oh, right.
ones.
No, I'm afraid I don't. They're obviously produced in great numbers because the tube stations, the Underground Electric Railway Company, used thousands and thousands and thousands of them. But no, I don't. I'm afraid they're tin glazed. That's all I do know. But
David on the
when,
chat has said Leeds and Stoke-on-Trent.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. I'm trying to get back to. Unfortunately, my new screens are stopping me doing what I want to do. So. Is that it with the questions?
And then there's one more comment from David. Barking is 1959 to 61 based on Rome Station.
Okay. All I could find on the internet was stations of the pictures of the interior of the station, not of the outside.
It was quite striking.
Yeah, 50s. It probably would. I mean, was it modernist in its interpretation?
Yes, very much so. Sort of because Barking is on a hill. It was built at the top of the hill. Sort of plain brick facade. I don't remember it very well, but I know that Ian Nairn, who was a great architectural critic of the time, praised it to the hilt. And it appeared on the front cover of his book on London.
He didn't suffer fools gladly, did he?
No, he didn't. Because he was the person who decided who was a fool or not. And Pevsner, I suppose, was wrong as well as, I think he was completely wrong about the Hoover building. And he's been wrong about quite a few things, Pevsner. We don't have to take his word as gospel, do we?
No, we don't. But I mean, he has seen more buildings than anyone else.
Yes.
But he did have very fixed views.
Yes.
But I mean, these stations do show what can be done by a public authority if they choose to. If they choose to sponsor good architecture and a company style and new architecture as well, then it shows that it can be done and it works and it still looks good 100 years later.
Yes,
it reminded me very much of the school buildings from counties from the 1930s. Some of those particularly the round sort of deco buildings and the brick ones. And again, very much a lot of those were all designed by the same architect for a county council or sort of the school authority. So
yeah.
I think we have no more questions, Ian.
What a shame. I would have thought there'd be lots.
Surely spoke too quickly.
All these people who had a misguided youth in London, you'd think that they would have.
Well, as I said at the start, I mean, I lived there for 50 years. I used the tube probably every day for 30 years. And yet, I mean, you walk past these with blinkers on. And admittedly, at the time, I wasn't particularly interested in architecture to that level. I mean, obviously, you recognise Arnold's Grove was always a stunning building, but you don't think, wow, when you're a 10-year-old boy.
I remember Good Street quite well. And, we sort of duck into this sort of rather dark building with its toffee-coloured tiles and just shoot down the underground. You hardly noticed anything about it. I agree.
Especially if it was raining.
Yes. Okay.
Ian, I lived at the far end of one of the bits of the Metropolitan
Mhm.
and gazed out at a very substantial purple brick viaduct. But obviously that was built pretty early, and I think it was in way back in the steam train era, possibly not too long after 1900, and various bits of the Metropolitan were later abandoned back to ordinary railways, weren't they? Not part of the London Transport Network at all.
It used to run out to Quainton Road.
Somewhere beyond Amersham, halfway to
Yeah,
Aylesbury.
yeah.
Yeah.
Quainton Road, which is in Leicestershire almost.
My goodness.
But
Well,
it's now
yes,
occupied by the Great Central Railway, the steam train
yes,
um, set up. But I mean, a lot of the lines were initially were mainline stations. Like Baker Street was a mainline station, and they ran trains out to on the Chiltern line.
mm,
Later became they moved them to Marylebone, but originally Baker Street was going to be the headquarters of the whole Chiltern Railway Company, but they redesigned it for flats.
yes, yes.
Presumably, there's more money to
I
be
mean, the
made.
Watford Spur, the station at Watford Metropolitan was, like any other railway station with chunk of plastic across the front door.
Yep. I mean, a lot of those stations out in the sticks like that look like little cottages.
Did they really?
I
Mm,
mean, they didn't want to stick out, I suppose, which is why,
no,
to some extent, Southgate is a surprise still to this day.
yes. Well, there were obviously very, very active land developers out along the Metropolitan that, somebody funded the railway quite so far out.
Yes. One wonders whether there were the same vested interests in the housing builders and the railway builders.
Yes,
Um,
yes,
one was funding the other effectively.
yeah. I mean, the thought of North Middlesex at Southgate being open fields awaiting development in what, the early 30s,
Yeah,
33 or something,
yeah.
incredibly late on.
I mean, Oakwood Station was literally built in the middle of a field. And the fact that they could just change their mind and move the terminus up to Cockfosters, which is about a mile and a half away,
Yes,
um,
yes,
the next year, and the
yes,
depot, the huge, great depot at the end of the line, runs between the two stations.
yes. I think Dagenham took the biscuit for absence of design. I mean, it was barely an assemblage of parts off the technician's desk. A very, very feeble effort. It was built in 31, so presumably there was a massive cut in any allowable expenditure that year.
But it was also the district railway and not the Underground Electric Railway Company or any of the other central tube
Oh,
lines.
so poorer finance, was it?
Yeah, possibly. But I
Hmm.
mean, certainly the design was not up to the standard of the other tube companies.
Don't think you could use the word. It was awful.
Mm. But I
And
did,
yet it would be serving the great Ford factories, wouldn't it?
Yep.
You'd think it would be better than a better quality.
Gosh.
I
Hmm.
did take a slide out of my presentation, which actually listed the various owners of Hornchurch Station on the same line, and there were 7 of them over the years. It changed company 7 times.
Good grief.
So you have to wonder about how much investment some of these companies put into them when they only held them for a short time.
So when did London Transport take over?
Well, the London Transport Passenger Board was set up in 33.
Okay.
Excuse me. Prior to that, the stations on the district line going out to Dagenham were run by the district railway. In fact, at one point, I think they were taken over by LMS. Let me just have a look. Got that, I think.
Yes, the mainline railways all had a shake-up, didn't they? An
Yes.
amalgamation about then.
Yeah, Hornchurch Station. In 1854, it was the London and Tilbury and Southend Railway. In 1885, it was the Barking and Pitsea Railway. In 1902, it was taken over by the Metropolitan and District Railway. It was electrified in 1908. In 1912, it was bought out by the Midland Railway. Then was amalgamated into the London, Midland and Scottish Railway in 23. In 32, the electrification was improved and the station rebuilt, which is what I showed you. And then in 33, it became part of London Transport.
Right.
So you can understand why some of these companies presumably didn't plan to hold it long term, therefore they didn't invest much.
Mm.
I got something.
Oh, Chris would like to ask.
Yeah, Ian, I grew up in London and I know the tube system fairly well, but I'm also, in a sense, more interested in the surface railways. I used to go from Barking, or in fact from Woolgrange Park, to South Tottenham on the Kentish Town line from Barking, surface railway. And there's always what I call the Cinderella surface lines within the London area itself, which get barely a mention these days. I just wondered if in your next talk you could do the architecture of the surface railways in London as well. I'm fascinated by that.
Well, they've been kind of rejuvenated by being brought into the system.
Is most of the stations were built in a similar sort of time. Unlike the tube stations, which were built over a fairly long period, you get the different architectural styles. Most of the railway stations were built in the 19th century.
Indeed.
Even the ones like the ones that served Alexander Palace and go to all sorts of places that haven't had railways for years.
Well, my station, Woolgrange Park, was gas lit. The trains, of course, were steam engines.
Yeah.
Diesel came in 1960. It was mainly wood, as far as you get the impression, with a bit of concrete underneath it, as far as a schoolboy was concerned. And you had decent trains with doors you could open at the last minute and get in, and no one could stop you if you were late. All that's gone, I know, but I would love you to do the architecture of these old 19th century stations which still exist in London. So certainly Woolgrange Park does. I don't
Have a
know.
look. If there's enough variation in them, then perhaps I can try and put something together. But I have a fear that they will all look very similar.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any more comments or questions?
Just lots of people saying thank you, Ian, for a really interesting and informative session.
Yes. And I hope we haven't lost them, because I just wanted to wish everybody from us all a very, very happy Christmas and a Merry New Year, or the other way around. And see everybody on January the 16th.
Yes. Happy Christmas. Yeah.
Happy
Christmas.
Christmas.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ian.
very much.
Thank you, Ian.
Bye-bye.
Very
Have
much.
fun.
Thank you, Ian.
I'm going to end the meeting for everyone now. Thank you, everyone.